Welcome to Pause for the Truth, where you can sit back, relax, and hear an honest dialogue about health, wealth, legal, and social issues. The hosts are Dr. Rogers Kane, family practice physician, and Jocelyn Turner, health education consultant, with co-hosts from the Northeast Florida Medical Society and its foundation. Stay tuned for the truth about matters affecting you and your family. We're here to tell you what's really going on and why. Good evening and welcome to Pause for the Truth. I am your co-host, Jocelyn Turner. It's a beautiful day, beautiful weather. It's such a beautiful time here in Northeast Florida. You'll see from our screen that my co-host is not with us at this moment, but I assure you he will be logging on shortly. And of course, I'm talking about Dr. Rogers Kane. Before I introduce our special guest, though, our so-called behind-the-scenes technology expert, or wizard as he calls himself, decided to come from behind the screen and join us on camera. How are you doing this evening, Tyrone?
I am doing well, Miss Jocelyn, doing well. Glad to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm so excited. Every time I see this gentleman, I just am in awe. And I'm not joking or I'm being very serious about this, because if you have ever heard Rodney Hurst speak, you will be captivated about his vast knowledge about Jacksonville and so many other things. How you doing this evening, Mr. Hurst?
I am great, Ms. Turner, and good to be with you and Mr. Jackson. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you this evening.
I tell you what, I'm reminded as we celebrate and honor Black history here in Jacksonville in Northeast Florida, I'm reminded, Mr. Hurst, of a couple of years ago when I attended the inaugural Civil Rights Conference here in Jacksonville. I've been looking forward to that happening again. That was amazing. You did an amazing job. I know you didn't do it alone, so I'll have to acknowledge Dr. Jameson, because I know he was your co-partner in that, I believe, but that was amazing. And the things that I heard from some of the attendees, the way you all staged that thing, where we got to have small group conversations, that was unbelievable.
It was a lot of fun. It's when you work on projects like that, it's a labor of love, especially bringing in from Dr. Dyson to Dr. Rabowski to Dr. Cole to Leon Russell, and just talking about issues and sharing, and let people in Jacksonville and others who were visiting and who attended, other guests, become much more cosmopolitan about the issues. And of course, as we can look back then and then come to now, we understand how evil and insidious racism is. Mm-hmm. So you cannot talk enough about what you need to do, how you confront the enemy, if you will, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with an emboldened and an evil and an innumerable, if you will, enemies that not only seek to demonize the atmosphere. They take a term like DEI, which they created, in place of affirmative action, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can you be upset with those three words? But they found a way to demonize them.
Yeah.
So they had already demonized affirmative action. So now something that is as docile and passive as DEI, they demonize that. And at the same time, no one has dealt with the racism, the systemic racism, and the atmosphere in which this country was founded. The racism, the original sin of slavery, which begat white supremacy and racism. But what it says to me is that we always have to be mindful of who we are and the fact that we are identifiable by how we look.
Right.
And there is no concept of merging in. I always tell folk when they say, well, you know, America is a melting pot. I said, no, America's not a melting pot. America is a big cauldron, a big pot of stew. And you can identify each of the ingredients. You can identify the potatoes and the meat and the carrots and the different ingredients. We cannot blend in. The whole process, the concept of blending in also means that to varying degrees, they cancel who you are by canceling your history, which is what they're trying to do now by banning history and also banning Black history books. And we have to be mindful of that. I tell folk in this integration generation that we so much want to be a part of what white folk are doing. You know, we don't want to be left out. We want to make sure that when it's time to go to the football game, that we can sit in their section or sit in their box. Or when it's time to go on a cruise, they will invite us along, or when it's time to go to lunch. So instead of us being who we are, we go along to get along, and we develop what I call comfort speak. We end up saying things that we think white folk want to hear. And correspondingly, our communication is not honest. The whole concept of guilty and uncomfortable is ridiculous, but that's what's out there. Oh, we don't want to teach anything to make white folk feel guilty and uncomfortable. Well, if white folk never did anything to be guilty and uncomfortable, then with ancestors coming along, if their ancestors didn't treat my ancestors so arrogantly and so evilly and treat us like property, then when I talk about how your ancestors treated my ancestors, which is part of my history, you wouldn't have a need to feel guilty and uncomfortable if we believed in the Christianity of brotherhood and sisterhood, which this country was not founded on.
You know, just a follow-up to that, and welcome, Dr. Kane, for joining us. I told them that you were going to be a little bit, that you would be chiming in soon, so welcome.
My apologies, and I'll do that in a minute. But hello, Mr. Hurst, I apologize for being late, but it was one of them days at the clinic. But go ahead.
So I wanted to follow up on.
We all have those days.
We have them days.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something, because a conversation I remember having as a follow-up to the civil rights conference that you held are some of the younger white folks saying that they didn't know about some of the historical facts that came about out of that conference. It was never taught to them in grade school nor in college. And that was just so mind-boggling to me. And so with books being taken out, it's worse now than 2 years ago.
I've had sessions with graduate students, not only here in Jacksonville, but outside of Jacksonville, where I talk about things that I call American history incomplete, dishonest, and racist. And obviously it's also romanticized. So I'm talking to graduate students. These are Black students, both graduate and undergraduate, but still they've been through 12 years of public school. They've been through 4 years of undergraduate school. Now they're working on their master's, some even working on their doctorate, and they're hearing some things about Black history for the first time. They are, when I talk about some folk who history identifies as being white and they were not white, and I talk about the whole concept of not only is history racist, but archaeology is racist also. And when you understand it, and like I say to them, never expect the oppressor to tell your story the way you can tell it. which is why in my second book, Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told, we like to think that education is so pure that it is not subject to being politicized, that there is no racism, that history speaks for itself, and that's not so, as we have seen. And I ask young people this one question always, no matter young people and not so young. Why do you think they want to ban your history and also ban Black history books? Tell me, explain that to me. Why do you think they want that done?
They can't. They don't understand.
I remember hearing a politician say because they don't bear responsibility for the sins of their ancestors.
But see, that's all, and I've heard that too, and that's always the convenient response.
Yeah.
I didn't do it.
Right.
You know, you're blaming me for something, but yet you want to hold on to the names of Robert E. Lee, and you want to hold on to the like here in Jacksonville, we had a school named as a result of a recommendation from the Daughters of the Confederacy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a founder of the Klan. He was a slave trader. He was the first imperial wizard of the Klan. He was a general in the enemy government, the Confederacy. And I always tell young people, stop referring to the Civil War as the war between the North and the South. There was no war between the North and the South. There was a war between the United States of America and an enemy government consisting of 11 states that seceded from the United States of America and formed the Confederacy to overthrow the United States of America to maintain slavery and a free labor economy lifestyle. So they are so confused and twisted because of the kind of history and the way history is taught to them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And many of them get angry that, you know, Mr. Hurst, you mean for 12 years, for 14 years, they've been teaching us this and we never question it because it's in the history books and the teachers are standing up and teaching it. I said, which is why you never accept something as a final word without doing some research on it yourself, especially when it comes to your history.
Ms. Turner can probably tell you one of the things that I've always said when it comes down to Confederacy is that when these people proclaim, you know, Confederate, want to fly their flag and stuff of that nature, I personally feel that it's treason because you pledge an allegiance to another nation outside of the United States. That's treason. I mean, you know, if you did it for Palestine, guess what they would do? They'll call you a treasonous.
In Germany, you cannot display the swastika.
Nope, you cannot.
You cannot erect a statue to Adolf Hitler or to Himmler or to any of the evil generals that he had, that he put together to overthrow, to marginalize Jews and other ethnic groups, and to make Germans the conquerors of the earth for the next 1,000 years, which was what his plan was. It's against the law to do that. But here in this country, we wrap our arms, white folk wrap their arms around Confederates as if they were heroes. And then, of course, what they call the lost cause is that they hit upon this strategy to say, well, yeah, we lost the war, but our cause was honest, that it was genuine, that we were really trying to do some things. And then, of course, up sprouts all of these monuments and statues and memorials to an enemy government that sought to overthrow the United States of America to keep those with a black hue of skin chained and enslaved for time immemorial.
And that
And
tells
that's
you
what
that's a perfect lead into just the statement I wanted to make, and that is, they're quick to propose the history of rescuing savages from Africa. Well, hell, the savages are the ones that brought us over here and cut out our groin, hung us by the necks, beat us till we were near dead, and some of them till they got dead. That's savagery. Okay?
and plus, they did not kidnap savage Africans.
Well,
They kidnapped persons from Africa who knew how to till the soil, who knew about animal husbandry, who knew how to deal with infrastructure. The image that white folk would want you to think of is Africans in grass skirts, living in grass huts, running around, speaking gibberish and not knowing what they talk about. And I say to young blacks and young whites, or anyone who would listen, our history did not start in Africa. But if you can imagine, and obviously we do because we know it, after you bring kidnapped persons who knew who they were in their country, you brought them to this country, then you get the white religious establishment to follow you in considering human beings with warm blood coursing through their body as property.
Yeah.
So when you consider Africans as property, you don't violate any of the teachings of the Bible or the teachings of Jesus Christ.
But
every white religious denomination in this country owns slaves.
And
every Ivy League college in this country had enslaved persons to build buildings on their campuses and also to build their infrastructure.
I want to back up.
Look at the latest with the King James version of the Bible that condones slavery, and ask us to be mindful and true to our masters and what they wanted, that allowed them to just totally abuse us in a savage fashion. It makes it difficult to adhere, and that's just my personal view, to adhere strictly to religion when people are preaching the King James version of the Bible, which showed up in 18 whatever.
Well, the King James version, of course, was translated by man, and they kept certain books. They kept certain books out of the Bible. So when you look at the Apocrypha, when you look at the Ethiopian Bible, which has 87 books, then you read something else. But some of these institutions, both corporations and famous families and universities, Georgetown College, which is now Georgetown University, in 1838, Georgetown College was founded by Catholic priests, Jesuit priests. In 1838, they got in trouble keeping the doors of Georgetown open. And they sold 272 of their enslaved persons, realizing $115,000, which translates to about $3 million today, to keep the doors open. And when you research it a bit further, these same Catholic priests owned 5 slave plantations in the South. So the question was, why did Catholic priests own slaves? Southern Baptists got together in Augusta, Georgia in 1845 and founded the Southern Baptist Convention with the express purpose of supporting slavery. So when we understand that history, then we understand that the support of slavery was not isolated just to elected officials or civic persons, but the white religious establishment went along for the ride for whatever the benefit was for them to own human flesh, black human flesh.
Mr. Hurst, I want to ask you a question, Dr. Kane. Sorry, I got to get this in.
Go ahead. I'm
So,
sorry.
what inspired you to become, and I call you, and forgive me if I'm saying it wrong, but what inspired you to become an activist, and how does Jacksonville's Black history influence your work?
I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. And my pastor says favor ain't fair. So when I tell people that, I always tell them, if you don't know what favor ain't fair means, you ask somebody. So I walked around as a preteen.
Let me ask somebody, what does it mean?
All right.
Let me ask somebody, what does it mean?
But yeah, ask them what favor ain't fair means.
No,
So I walked around asking teachers and my ministers and others, why were there water fountains that had colored and white on it? Why were there waiting rooms that were colored and white? Why was it when we would go to a doctor's office or to a governmental building that blacks had to sit one place, Negroes or colored, which was the vernacular at that time, and whites sit someplace else? And the answer that would always come back to me was, that's just the way things are. Until 8th grade. And I enrolled as my family moved from one segregated black neighborhood to another segregated black neighborhood in Jacksonville. And I enrolled, I transferred from James Weldon Johnson Black Junior High School to Isaiah Blocker Black Junior High School.
What year are we looking at, Mr. Hurst?
This is 1955.
Okay.
I was 11 years old.
Okay.
And I enrolled in an American history class, and the American history teacher was Rutledge Pearson. And the first day of the class, he would tell his class, he would show them the book, Life in these United States, approved for Negro students in this Negro junior high school in the Negro division of the Duval County public school system. And he would tell us everything about the book. Then he would slam the book down on his desk and say, leave it home. Because he refused to teach us American history from a book that only had the name of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington in the entire book. He also said to us constantly, freedom is not free. If you're not a part of the solution, then you are a part of the problem. And he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP, which I did at age 11. He was the advisor to the Youth Council. I became president at age 15. I led the sit-in demonstration 16. At age 16, 2 months after I graduated from high school. But that's what started my journey. Prior to my graduating from high school, I met Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, who came to Jacksonville to work with Earl Johnson, local NAACP attorney at that time, who filed the school desegregation suit in December of 1960. We brought Roy Wilkins in December of 1960 after Axe Handle Saturday. I met A. Philip Randolph, though born in Crescent City, Florida, always considered Jacksonville his home after his family moved here when he was 2. And he graduated from the only institution in the state of Florida where blacks could graduate from high school, Cookman Institute, which merged with Mary McLeod Bethune School for Girls for Bethune-Cookman. Mm-hmm. But I got my start from a black school teacher who wanted to make sure his students understood who they were and the great legacy of their blackness. I did a book report in 8th grade at age 11 on Toussaint Louverture. He had a list of persons, of books, and I just happened to pick out Toussaint Louverture. The name of the book was The Slave Who Freed Haiti. I've got the book back here somewhere here. I was at I attended I spoke at the Penn Center in South Carolina, and I made the comment about this book. And one of the persons who attended that found this book. I had not seen this book since 1955. This is the first book report that I did on Toussaint Louverture, who led the only successful slave revolt in this hemisphere, in that portion of Hispaniola now considered Haiti. And it so frightened the French and the Americans, the British, and the Spanish, that they put a blockade around Haiti. In fact, some people say that blockade still exists today. There is a reason why Haiti is the poorest country in this hemisphere. To the extent after they ended slavery in Haiti, Napoleon had to sell the Louisiana Territory to this country because he couldn't control the shipping routes, because he no longer had that stronghold there in Central America, in Haiti. So the history of Toussaint Louverture and the United States are inextricably bound. But you will not see the name of Toussaint Louverture in any American history book that young people study. In the first time I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and they always advise that you start in the basement with slavery and work your way up. There is a statue of Toussaint Louverture in the basement of the museum. And you know, I was just as happy as I could be to see that.
Did you take a selfie with it?
Huh?
Did you take a picture next to it?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. That was my first book report. And hadn't heard him. You don't hear much about him today, even though he's considered the father of Haiti. But he was a stalwart in world history and also in American history. But we don't even touch anything. We don't even teach him or teach anything about him. So to answer your question in my roundabout way.
So are there any overlooked moments in Jacksonville's civil rights history that we should be talking about more?
Well, my second book is called Unless We Tell It Never Gets Told. And I start with James Weldon Johnson and A. Philip Randolph, John Rosamond Johnson, Augusta Savage, Johnetta Betch Cole. There's a church in Jacksonville. It's the oldest Black congregation in the state of Florida. It was founded in 1838. It's called Bethel Baptist Institutional Church. It now calls itself the Bethel Church, large church, mega church. It was founded in 1838 by 6 whites and 2 enslaved persons. And the reason, when you look at the history of a lot of Black churches and their founding, and you see white folk, was after the Denmark-Vesey revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, at Emmanuel AME Church in 1818, whites would not allow Blacks to create or form a church by themselves. It was too much for them of an opportunity for them to plan a revolt. So Bethel was started with these 6 whites and 2 Blacks. And Blacks had to get permission from the plantation owners to come to the church, which they did. And as the church grew to the end of the war in 1865, there were many more enslaved persons than whites. Then whites tried to leave or left Bethel, and they wanted to take the name. And the newly freed enslaved persons took them to court and won the suit to keep the name of Bethel Baptist Institutional Church.
Wow.
In 1892, John Milton Waldron from Washington, D.C. became the pastor. John Milton Waldron became the treasurer of the Niagara Movement. He was one of the founders of an organization called the National Negro Committee, which was the forerunner of the NAACP. The National Negro Committee was founded in 1909, and in 1910, they changed their name from the National Negro Committee to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And John Milton Waldron of Bethel Church in Jacksonville was one of the founders of both organizations.
Wow.
A. Philip Randolph here, James Weldon Johnson writing, and John Rosemond Johnson writing Lift Every Voice and saying in Jacksonville on the campus of Bethel Baptist Institutional Church. Bethel Baptist Institutional Church started the Florida Baptist Academy, which is now Florida Memorial University in Miami Lakes, Florida, one of the 4 HBCUs in the state of Florida. So Jacksonville has great Black history. Jacksonville was a major city on a very important transportation route in the state of Florida, right along US 1, A1A, and there are a lot of folk who left Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, and moved to Florida and stopped in Jacksonville and stayed. A lot of Gullah Geechee heritage here in Jacksonville. So Jacksonville's history is just so extensive. We had an African-American task force that I was a part of, and I chaired a African-American history timeline, which we started in 1838 with the founding of Bethel. And we took it through the 2020 with different things that have happened in Jacksonville since that time. The problem with all of that is that with the state of Florida and the Department of Education, led by the governor, deciding that we need to stop teaching Black history and we need to ban Black history books, and the way they have intimidated teachers, both in public education and also in the university and college systems.
Mm-hmm.
You have teachers afraid to teach the truth.
Yeah.
Because they are afraid that someone is listening or someone is going to report them to the principal. We have a very racist school board, which just changed. But even before the school board changed, there were certain things that they could not implement based on what was happening in Tallahassee, Florida. And we are still dealing with a lot of that.
Then how can we, I know we have you on the podcast tonight, and we know none of us are going to live forever. So how can we then still get this rich information? I call it rich because our history is rich. Because you've named some people tonight, quite frankly, that I've never heard of. I'm ashamed to say, as old as I am. And so how do we tell our stories to younger people more, other than short of having conferences like you held a couple of years ago? Do we need to do it at a smaller level? What do you suggest for folks who are listening? And
Mr. Hurst, before you answer that, let me ask you this question. Let me piggyback on what Jocelyn did. The new Black History Museum that they just, approved at the state, and Florida Memorial, since you mentioned them a few minutes ago, it's now Florida Memorial University. They donated some of the land to them for the creation of that Black History Museum. And so I just want to, as you begin to elaborate on what Ms. Turner asked you, I just wanted to also talk about the role that may play, or can play, in your perspective, your perspective insight as to will play in terms of delivering adequate and proper information as it relates to Black history.
When Florida Baptist Academy changed to Florida Normal and they left Jacksonville, they moved to St. Augustine. They were called Florida Normal College. Later, they became Florida Memorial, and then they moved from St. Augustine to Miami the Miami area, but they continued to own the land where the college was. So when the lobbying began, they basically said, hey, you know, we've got land to put this new museum on. Ironically, the persons who came to Jacksonville to lobby for this Black museum in St. Augustine were white.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that museum is going to look like. Sometimes I question. I have to step back sometime and realize that white folk are not going to tell my story the way I'm going to tell it. And they're not going to talk about Black history the way I'm going to talk about it. So I can always or should always expect a vanilla or a sanitized version of some things when it comes to Black history if I'm not in charge. And even sometimes when we are in charge, if they are paying to for the operational money, then you've got a problem. One of the things I say to churches and fraternal organizations and others as we in Jacksonville celebrate 125 years of the writing of Lift Every Voice and Sing here in Jacksonville, we have to begin to tell the story no matter how little we tell and no matter what we tell, because doing nothing is not an option. But we have to take the same zeal that we have in our churches and in our fraternal organizations and in our social organizations and in our community to teach Black history. Throughout this community and other communities, there were Super Bowl parties and churches had tailgate parties and wear your favorite jersey of the team that you were supporting, which is good. I mean, that camaraderie is good, but use that same zeal, that same zest, that same organization and activity in talking about Black history.
Yes.
Because our history, as it has been told, can get to be. I was talking to some high school students and I asked them, what's your favorite subject? And they said, blah, 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 whatever. I said, what about history? Mr. Hurst, history is boring. History is this, history is that. I said, and the reason it is boring is because your history teachers don't talk about you.
So white history is boring.
They don't talk about people who look like you, who made salient contributions to American history. When you understand, even in world history, three of my favorite stories: The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, Man in Iron Mask, written by Alexander Dumas, who was Black. Alexander Pushkin, the father of Russian literature, was Black. St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the seminal figures in the Christian faith, and I'm a Christian, who wrote some of the greatest philosophical writings about Christianity, and for whom St. Augustine in the state of Florida was named, was Black. Hannibal the Great, with his hordes of elephants, were Black. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg, Black. The great grandmother of Queen Elizabeth, the recently deceased Queen of England.
Black.
And she was Black. And the father and the grandfather of Ludwig von Beethoven were Moors, Spanish Africans. And then I asked him one day, I said, who was Mansa Musa? And they kind of laughed. They said, who? I said, who was, let me change how I identify him. Who was King Mansa Musa of Mali? They didn't have a clue. He was the richest man in the history of civilization.
Yeah.
You know, so when you talk about that, and you talk about Daniel Hill Williams and Garrett Morgan and Charles Drew and Granville Woods, when you talk about Elijah McCall, when you talk about those persons that made a difference, that's why history is not exciting. That's why it's boring. History was my favorite subject. And it was my favorite subject because my American history teacher, who was my favorite teacher and my mentor, made history exciting. So when we get together in our groups, do something with Black history. One, I spoke at a church Sunday, and the pastor asked me, Mr. Hurst, what one thing would you recommend that we have our young people do to get them interested in Black history? I said, have them learn Lift Every Voice and Sing, and then have them interpret each stanza, each verse written by James Weldon Johnson, so that they can interpret why he wrote the words the way he wrote it in 1900, 35 years after the end of slavery.
What a challenge. I think more than just young people need to do that, by the way.
You know, right now when we have I learned Lift Every Voice and Sing in 4th grade. Right now, whenever we have programs and we're going to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, which we do quite often, obviously, we always have it printed on the program. I told them if they didn't want to do that, I said, let's not put it on the program. Let's learn the song. Well, you know, but when it's time to sing it, and okay, we don't need to sing it. Let the Oakwood University Choir or Hampton University or Edward Waters or Florida A&M Choir, let them sing it, even if it's nothing more than a video. The bottom line is we don't take our Black history seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, then our young people are not going to take it seriously, and their young people are not going, and that's going to go from generation to generation. We have to make sure that there is a reason why the legacy of our Blackness relates to our Black human dignity and respect. When you eliminate a people's history, you eliminate them. If there's nothing you can go back to and talk about what your people did in developing this country, this American country, racist though it is, but this country would have never developed. Even in slavery, enslaved persons are responsible for the founding of American capitalism in Wall Street. In 1840, there were 5 million enslaved persons in this country. They were worth more than 70% of all the businesses and corporations in this country. In 1820, there were more millionaires in Mississippi based on slavery for agriculture than any other state in this country.
Wow.
So we made this country. At the end of the war, the American government gave enslavers, the slave owners, reparations for every enslaved person they lost as a result of the end of the war. Didn't give us anything. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president, even though what was out there was 40 acres and Sherman threw in the army mules because the war was over, Andrew Johnson changed all of that. He was a sympathizer both for slavery and a supporter of the South. So we didn't get the 40 acres and a mule. We got nothing. In 1930, when Social Security came into being under the Roosevelt administration, as a handout to the South, they did not include domestic workers and migrant workers in the Social Security Administration. 65% of Blacks in this country, when the Social Security Act went into being in the 1930s, 65% of migrant workers and domestic workers were Black. So for 30 years, we were not subject to Social Security. And that safety net enabled a lot of folk after they retired and could no longer work to get on their feet. We didn't have that. The GI Bills were not applicable for veterans. And I'm a veteran. I served in the Air Force. When I got out of the Air Force in 65, when I got married in 66, and I went to get a loan to do certain things, I had to go through a lot of roundabouts. I eventually got what I wanted, but the average person would have met those obstacles and could not have done anything. Same thing happened after the First World War. I mean, which is the first great migration, when Black veterans, after fighting an international enemy, came back to the South, having to deal with segregation, and took their families north and east after World War I. And 1919, there were more than 35 race massacres, started by whites who were upset that these Blacks in this first Great Migration were moving from the South to the North. And they were moving because they didn't want to stay in the South anymore after fighting in World War I. James Weldon Johnson, who was the field secretary for the NAACP, investigated all of those race massacres at that time. And he called that summer in 1919 Red Summer. So there is so much of our history out there, but we've got to want to teach it. We've got to, there's a Ethiopian proverb that says—
we need to clone you though. We need to clone you though.
Huh?
I said, we need to clone you because no one can tell it like you can.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Hurst.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned about Social Security. What knowledge you have on Medicare and its implementation?
I'm sorry. What?
What information do you have on Medicare and its implementation?
If you draw a line between Medicare and Medicaid and what happened with Social Security in 1930, you see now where white elected officials don't want to expand and extend Medicare and Medicaid so that everyone would have the right to health care.
Yeah.
And it goes to, in this country, that anything that many white racist elected officials think will benefit Black folk, they don't want any parts of it. They don't want to approve it. In fact, it's funny when you look at some of the videos and interviews they've done when they talk about the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. And they interview, I'll never forget, this guy was from Kentucky, white. And so the reporter said, would you want to get medical care? Yeah. Well, would you want to get Obamacare? No, I don't want Obamacare. Well, the Affordable Care Act is Obamacare. Well, if it's intended for Negroes, then I don't want it. And this is, from 2000 on. The bottom line is Black folks still have been so demonized in this country, and anything that many whites think benefit Blacks, they either don't want to support it, approve it, they don't want any parts of it, and elected officials try to whittle it down. When they talk about taking away portions of Social Security now and Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and SNAP and WIC, it's because they think that only Black folk benefit from that. And if they did their homework, they will find out their white constituents benefit more from those programs than we do, just based on sheer numbers.
Let me expand on what you just said from a Medicare perspective. And it might be the only little stuff I do know, but I think I know. Let me put it that way. When Medicare was brought into play, originally, the first time it was looking at being brought into play, I think it was in the early 1930s. And it could have been actually proposed in the 1920s. But what happened, what I heard about it, what happened was it was supposed to be what Medicare was going to take care of. You know, when you get a certain age, Medicare was going to, you know, pitch in and take care of 100% of your medical needs, yada, yada, yada. The whites, and they named a particular person, I can't recall all the details, but he said, no, if we gave Medicare to African Americans, black folks, they call them niggas at the time. We gave Medicare to niggas. What would happen is that they may live longer. So what we want to do is add a tax on it by saying Medicare will pay for 80% of your service. The other 20% would have to be provided by the individual. And they thought that that would keep most black folks out of the realm, out of the purview of Medicare, because they couldn't afford the 20%. And now, you know, and you're more of a historian than I am. This is what I kind of read and with other people reporting it. But the reason for the 20% of Medicare is simply because one guy came along and said, we should not allow 100% coverage of Medicare because black folks may benefit from it. They may get healthier. But if you charge 20%, they can't afford it, and they get much sicker and die off. It's kind of a paraphrase of what they said.
Well, the interesting thing is Medicare, as we know it today, started and was included in the Civil Rights Bill.
Yep, 1964 somewhere.
1964, yeah, and of course it has grown since then, and it has been expanded upon. And of course, the fundamental thing about Medicare for healthcare is that medical help should be a right, not a privilege.
Universal health care.
And no one wants to deal with that. It is so unfortunate that of the so-called free world, that a lot of your major countries don't charge nearly as much for healthcare as we do here in this country because of the commercialism of both big pharma and hospitals and medicine and all of that. But the bottom line is, it is so ingrained now, and it has saved so many people who were looking at disasters in having to pay for tragic surgeries and circumstances when it came to healthcare. But if there's any way that they can deplete a portion of what you receive as black folk, then obviously they will do that. But they cannot take it from us without taking it from some of their white constituencies. And so that is the saving grace, if you will, because they don't want to take it from them. That would be a political suicide mission.
FYI, implementation of Medicare occurred, like you said, in 1964, but and you can check me on the historical fact, I don't know the exact detail, but one of the problem was that when Lyndon Baines Johnson signed off on this whole thing, how did you guarantee the participation of white folk, hospitals, and so on and so on? How did you make sure that they were participating in Medicare and giving it to African Americans? And what wound up happening was black physicians almost became G-men. Yeah, you remember the government men, G-men, yada, yada, yada. And they would report to those, back to the government, anybody that would not allow African American physicians on their staff, because it kind of also led into integration. Now,
and also in the hospitals, in a lot of these rural and hospitals, southern state hospitals, if you wanted any of that money,
yeah, that's it.
You had to make sure that black patients were admitted to your hospital.
Integration. That's what led some of them.
Then you could not partake
in
of the hundreds of millions of dollars, ultimately billions of dollars that was available to your hospitals, and that started 60 years ago. So the thing is that I always tell folk, we don't have the same signs. You don't see the colored and white signs. So we're not talking about picketing and sitting in and some of the things that we did back then. But we are talking about keeping these businesses accountable. Just like some of these businesses who, for whatever reason, including intimidation out of Washington, D.C., are saying, oh, yeah, well, we supported DEI last year. We're not supporting it now. So if you don't want to support DEI, why should I continue to spend my money with you? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that you're going to see increasingly. I know the National Action Network is doing that. Dr. Sharpton, Reverend Sharpton, is looking into that, and there are other ministers individually are doing that. But at some point in time, in the next few months, you're going to see a coalition of folk coming together that says, hey, let's stop spending our money. Back during the time when we boycotted downtown Jacksonville, the NAACP said, don't call it boycott, call it a selective buying program. So you selectively decide where you're going to spend your money.
Target had, Mr. Son, I'm just going to make this statement, and then I'm done. Target promised about 25, I'm going to say billion, I can't remember the exact number. When George Floyd happened, they said in the beginning of 2025, they were going to go on ahead and spend this kind of money towards, African-American DEI type stuff. And then all of a sudden, here it is in January, they decide they want to renege on it. Right. So because the president says it's okay. That was a monetary, more so than probably what the president said, but that had a significant monetary influence on Target's decision, is my opinion.
Target is in the crosshairs. There are several national organizations that have identified Target by name.
And they targeted Target.
They're targeting Target. Yeah, and I would not be surprised if Target is not the first national company that they don't deal with in terms of a selective buying program.
Well, Target's already been sued. Target has already been sued by its shareholders.
Yeah.
So what gives you hope for the future of Jacksonville's African-American community? I want to bring it back to Jacksonville for a minute.
Because we have survived. And I don't mean we just in Jacksonville, but I mean collectively we. When you understand that after the end of that evil war, and America said you're free and didn't give us land, property, food, money, clothing, we still survived in spite of, and we had to do things to survive, and we still in the process overcame the odds that white folk put in front of us. When you look at the Jim Crow laws and de jure and de facto segregation and different forms of discrimination and bigotry and black codes, and you look at the different things that white folk threw in the path of black folk since the end of the war between the United States and the Confederacy, and we still achieved and did certain things in spite of, it shows I support Black liberation theology. In fact, I knew Dr. James Cone, who was one of the leading proponents of that. And the bottom line is Dr. Cone's position was the same God that I worship as the oppressed is not the same God of the oppressor. Dr. Jeremiah Wright said, God came into history on the side of the oppressed. And if you're not Christian, that's fine. But those of us who are Christian, we understand that many of us made it, and Black folk collectively made it because God was on our side. And I think that many times, I was talking to a good friend of mine, Charlie Cobb, who's an icon in the civil rights movement, who now lives in Jacksonville. He said, Rodney, you know, after the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64, Voting Rights Act in 65 and 68, you know, some of us just got complacent. We figured that with civil rights and voting done, you know, those of us in SNCC and in some other organizations, we figured that the war, the fight, the battles were over. And the Lord has a way of saying to us, we want to make sure you understand the battle is never over. And that's why I always speak on the topic that the struggle continues. And it's always a struggle for Black folk because we are identifiable about who we are. I use this slogan many times when I talk to folk. Don't judge me until you know me. Don't underestimate me until you challenge me, and don't talk about me until you talk to me. And that just basically says, stay on your feet, understand what you're dealing with. Don't try to be all things to all people and go along to get along, because and I'm on Facebook and I posted the other day, you know, white folk will always be white folk. And that's something that we have learned, and that's not a negative. That has been proven over the years that when push comes to shove, no matter what it is, then white American Christian racism always rises up to take the lead in whatever we're dealing with. And we have to understand that we still have to fight for who we are. We fight racism and for our Black human dignity and respect. And no matter what it is, no matter how small it is, I tell people, when you talk to young people, tell them 3 things about Black history and tell them you want them to remember one of those 3 things. And then the next time you talk to them, you ask them, what of the 3 things that we talked about did you remember? And invariably, many of them remembered all 3.
All 3. So if you could send one message to city leaders and policymakers about the future of African Americans in Jacksonville, what would it be?
We ain't going nowhere.
In spite of?
In spite of, no matter, I mean, we've been around and we've been dealing with white American Christian racism in this country for years. When you understand that from being kidnapped and brought to this country and being kept in chains and everything that happened to us, we fought against you and fought for our freedom. And even after we were freed, we had to continue to fight because you were not fair, Christian white folk and Black Christian white folk. So we understood that, and we understood, some of us, Freddie Haynes, Dr. Freddie Haynes III, who was the pastor of Friendship West in Dallas, he used a term called bent back Negroes. And he basically said, when your back is bent, white folk can ride you all day long. But if you stand up straight like a man or a woman, they cannot ride you. We have a lot of bent back Negroes in this country who figure that if they go along, get along, and be a part of the Republican establishment, that white folk will take care of them.
Yeah.
But what we have to understand is that as long as we are identifiable, 2 things. Malcolm Graham said, what do you call a Black PhD? And the response was, you call him a nigger. And Dick Gregory said, white is not a color. White is an attitude. And we have to understand what racism is all about. Racism is not going anywhere. That river of racism flows in this country, and we saw a president dig into that river. Kamala Harris didn't lose because Black folk didn't turn out and vote for her. She lost because 52% of white females in 24, as they did in 20, as they did in 16, voted for misogynistic, sexist racists. And no matter how much they say they want to break the glass ceiling, they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 16 and didn't vote for Kamala Harris in 24. So we have to understand that. And I tell them, I don't trust you as an ally. Don't come to me and say you want me to sit and be a part of some of the meetings you have. I can't trust you. You know, so you're going to do whatever you're going to do. I'm going to do what I do with people I can trust. But like I always tell folk, doing nothing is not an option.
Wow, this has been a very inspiring conversation, and I promised you an hour, and I don't want to keep any more of your time because, as you said at the beginning, it's been a long day and it's going to be an even longer week. As we close,
I enjoy talking to you and Dr. Kane and my new friend, Mr. Jackson. So obviously,
don't make me a new friend. Don't make me a new friend.
So we like to give our guests an opportunity to share their final thoughts. And in your final thoughts regarding today's discussion, if you would kind of mention to our audience some of the things that are happening here in Northeast Florida the rest of this week or month that you can recall, and Tyrone will post those on our website.
Yeah, well, tomorrow night at the Bethel Church, the committee that's coordinating the 125th anniversary of Lift Every Voice and Sing is having a singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing with young people there at the church. Thursday night, I'm a part of a panel discussion on education. And that's going to be at the main public library on Laura Street. That's at 4:00. And then Friday at noon, I am speaking on Black history, again in the library as part of this 125th anniversary of Lift Every Voice and Sing. And there are other activities. I'm speaking at the Masonic Temple Saturday evening for their Black History program. And the important thing, even during this month, started by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926, Negro History Week. A lot of folk on the national scene were contemporaries. James Weldon Johnson, A. Philip Randolph, Ida B. Wells. A lot of these folk were around at the same time doing some of the same stuff, if you will, dealing with Black folk and dealing with the plight of Black folk. That was 100 years ago, and we're still doing it now. When I was in Mr. Pearson's class in 1955, 60 years ago, we were talking about some of the same things we're talking about now. 60 years ago, 50 years ago, when we sat in at the white lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville, and we were attacked by 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats, and most of us were high school students. They didn't care that we were high school students, and we were young people, that we were minors, if you will. They still attacked us because that's how whites always respond to Blacks seeking their human dignity and respect and their civil rights. But that did not stop our ancestors from doing it. That shouldn't stop us from doing it, because long after we are gone, our young people still have to take their place in an American society that really does not want them there. Wanted them here to make them obscenely wealthy, working them for free, but don't want to respect them and what they bring to the table today. So I say to young Black folk and not to young Black folk, be vigilant, understand who you are. When you see your Black face in a mirror, understand that Black face that's looking back at you, and understand that because you are an advocate for who you are does not make you anti-white. It makes you an advocate for what is right and what you stand for and what your history is and the legacy of your Blackness. Never forget that.
What are your books, Mr. Hurst? Because I know you referenced your second book, and I know about it was never about a hot dog and a Coke, but Tell our audience the name of your books.
Yeah, right over my head on that second shelf is my first book was It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke. That book I wrote because the white press blacked out all news about the 1960 sit-ins and Axe Handle Saturday. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s would not have been a civil rights movement in terms of publicity had it not been for the black press. The Pittsburgh Courier, Jet and Ebony, the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News. They covered the black civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And the next book is called Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told. And that deals with black history, starting with James Weldon Johnson, going to Augusta Savage and A. Philip Randolph and the other great blacks who either were born in Jacksonville or called Jacksonville home. The third book is Never Forget Who You Are. And I wrote that. I asked Dr. Jameson to write that with me. I wanted to look at racism from my eyes and then the generation right after me. So both of us look at racism from my 75-year-old eyes at that time and his 50-year-old eyes at the time. And the last book that I wrote for young blacks, 12 to 18, was called Black and Brilliant. And I've been very fortunate that all 4 books are national award winners.
That's awesome. 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 Thank you so much. Dr. Kane, what are your final thoughts regarding tonight's discussion? It was amazing, wasn't it?
The brief about it, it was. And I'm not going to try to go on. You know how I can be very. But here's what I really wanted to get across. I want to paraphrase what Mr. Hirsch said, and that is, there's a lot of battles we're taking on. But what people got to remember, it's a war. You can lose one battle, but you can win the war. So we got to remember that it's a war. It's long, it's ongoing. I want to respond to something said, what do you call the black president? That nigga. It's just what we hear.
What do you call a black PhD? Malcolm X, you call him a nigga.
Yeah. And I'm just calling it out with what some people say about our black president. The same thing.
Oh, yeah.
A black PhD.
Well, when you understand, Dr. King, that no matter your station in life,
exactly,
you can be a millionaire, you can be a celebrity, you can be a famous football player, baseball player, basketball player. Right. White folk always feel that it is their right to call you a nigger, irrespective of what you have accomplished.
And that's what I used to say. You still just another nigger. That's right. I mean, and that's not my opinion. I'm just saying what we see from them. I like the idea, looking into what we're going to, the whole thing, the different books and stuff. I really want to get into them. I got to go and buy some of the last 3 publications you had, because it went beyond the first. So you got about 4 publications. Am I correct with what I'm saying? Yeah. I think all our young black folks should need to go out and start looking at those different publications. At the end of the day, the biggest thing that I want people to recognize, and which is coincidence with what you said, is that we need to know our history, because you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from.
That's right.
Okay, where you came from. So get out, educate yourself, help your children to educate themselves, and keep it moving. Let it flow. Understand what America is all about, and to make sure that we can appreciate the contributions that, 1, Africans have made to America, and 2, that we continue to make to America. We are not, when they sit back and they start, we built this country.
Right.
Black women appreciate, and I'm talking to black men now, really appreciate what role your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, appreciate the role that they have played. Not saying disregard, current Black women, but really appreciate the role that they played in building this country and helping us Black men to survive in this country and our Black children. So with that, I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Tyrone, I'm sorry for overlooking you. What are your final thoughts regarding tonight's discussion?
Well, first of all, thanks to Rodney Hurst for coming on, a wealth of knowledge and information. I would like to borrow just a couple of things that I'm going to extract from that, and I hope others do. He made a statement that when you're encountering or talking with young Blacks, to tell them 3 things about history. Mm-hmm. Well, there's an underlying challenge in that. That means you have to know 3 things about history. So you got to do your work, you got to do your research. From where we come is irrelevant. The information is now available. So there's no excuse. The second thing he said was, there's a time when we became complacent. And complacency is running far too rampant, I will say. But there is an understanding that from complacency, you can make the decision to turn around. So from all that he said and all that we can gather, the simple thing is make the decision to be a part of the solution and do the very simple, educate yourself and spread that information.
Right.
Thank you, Tyrone. As we close this discussion, it's clear that Jacksonville's African-American history is one of resilience, progress, and ongoing advocacy. From the historic contributions of Black leaders to today's fight for equity, the journey continues. Mr. Hurst reminded us that while national policies shape our realities, change often starts at the local level. The issues we face, whether in voting rights, economic opportunity, or criminal justice, require collective action. To our listeners, your voice matters, whether through voting, supporting Black-owned businesses, joining grassroots movements, or simply staying informed. Every action contributes to the progress of our community. Jacksonville has a rich legacy, but its future is still being written. Let's make sure it's one of empowerment, justice, and opportunity for all. Stay engaged, stay informed, and keep pushing forward. And also make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss great podcasts such as this. Thank you, Mr. Hurst. You are absolutely amazing. I've always been a fan of yours. I still am. And one shameless plug, Tyrone, I'm saying it at the end so that you can wipe it out if we repeat this show, is on February 20th. Come and meet some local Black artists at the Jacksonville Urban League at 6 p.m. as we celebrate the legacy of Black literacy here in Northeast Florida. Thank you, and for tuning in to Pause for the Truth. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
And there we have it, another episode of the Pause for the Truth podcast in the proverbial books. Our heartfelt thanks go out to every one of you who took the time to tune in. Mark your calendars. We're here every Tuesday at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. Feel free to join our community on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. But the golden ticket? Subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's your passport to all our latest episodes and exclusive content. A special mention to the wizard behind the curtain, Tyrone Jackson from Call Tyrone IT Services. His technical prowess and unwavering dedication are the backbone of this podcast. Next week, we'll be back with more. Until then, tell your friends, tell your family about our show. Your support is invaluable. And remember, keep that curiosity alive. Keep seeking the truth.